Welcome to our channel Modern Crime Scope, where chilling mysteries, dark secrets, and true crime stories come to life. We dive deep into unsolved cases, haunting investigations, and shocking tales that keep you on the edge of your seat. If you love suspense, twists, and gripping storytelling, you're in the right place. Thomas Hale wasn't just another seasoned investigator. He was the man who uncovered the chilling truth behind a string of murders that turned New England's quiet towns into hunting grounds. What began as scattered cases of missing young adults spiraled into a dark revelation. Every victim was bound by a shared past, tied to a summer camp long forgotten. As Hale dug deeper, he realized the killings were no random spree, but a calculated reckoning, a trail of vengeance decades in the making. Each body carried a silent message, each scene a reminder that secrets buried in silence never truly die. And with every step closer to the truth, Hale found himself staring into the shadows of a killer who refused to be forgotten. The town of Ashford, nestled in the rolling hills of New England, had always been known for its postcard charm. The winding main street, lined with brick buildings and mom-and-pop shops, seemed frozen in time. Autumn painted the trees in fiery reds and golds, and every October, families gathered for pumpkin festivals and hay rides. But beneath this perfect image, unease began to seep through the cracks. The shift was subtle at first. A few missing persons posters taped to telephone poles, whispers exchanged in hushed voices at diners, anxious glances exchanged between neighbors. Then came the first body, and the town's illusion of safety crumbled overnight. The victim was a college student who had vanished after attending a weekend bonfire with friends. Days later, a hiker stumbled upon her body in a wooded clearing, far from the main trail. What startled investigators most was the condition of the scene. There were no footprints, no tire marks, nothing that gave away how she had been brought there. Her personal belongings were scattered deliberately, almost as if arranged. The strange scratches carved into her wrist puzzled authorities. It was an eerie detail that seemed meaningless at the time, but it planted the first seeds of dread. In the weeks that followed, 2 more victims were discovered in different towns across the region. Each case carried the same signature: secluded locations, carefully placed items, and those shallow markings that could not be explained away. Panic gripped communities that had once felt insulated from the kind of violence they read about in the headlines of larger cities. People who had never locked their doors began checking bolts twice at night. The local hardware store sold out of security cameras, and patrol cars prowled the streets with their lights dimmed, searching for any sign of movement in the shadows. Reporters swarmed into New England, transforming quiet neighborhoods into scenes of flashing cameras and news vans. The story spread fast, capturing national attention with its haunting details. The press labeled the unknown assailant the Shadow of New England, a name that stuck, whispered fearfully in kitchens, classrooms, and workplaces. For some, the nickname felt like an insult to their community, but for others it captured the terrifying reality of an enemy they could not see, who seemed to vanish into thin air after every attack. As the death toll rose, a chilling realization began to settle over the region. The killer was not acting impulsively. The crimes were deliberate, precise, almost ritualistic. Each victim was different in background and lifestyle, yet the way they were found suggested the work of someone who planned every detail with obsessive care. The randomness of the targets only deepened the fear, for it meant no one could predict who might be next. The atmosphere of New England shifted dramatically. Town meetings grew tense, school events were canceled, and once lively streets emptied as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. The land that had always been celebrated for its beauty now seemed cloaked in menace. The silence of the woods, once peaceful, now carried a weight of dread. And though police departments across multiple counties pooled resources and manpower, they could not shake the feeling that they were one step behind a predator who knew exactly how to stay hidden. It was Chief Investigator Thomas Hale who began to see the pattern that others had missed. A seasoned officer with nearly 3 decades of experience, Hale had worked homicide cases that stretched from the rough back alleys of Boston to the quietest corners of rural Vermont. Yet something about these murders felt different, something that gnawed at the back of his mind. He studied each crime scene report obsessively, laying them out across his desk, searching for even the smallest link. The arrangement of belongings, the scratches on the wrists, and the choice of remote wooded locations, they were not random. They were a signature. The idea of a serial killer operating across county lines unsettled local authorities. Each department had jurisdiction over its own area, and cooperation was often limited by politics and pride. But Hale ignored the bureaucratic barriers. He began traveling from town to town, retracing the steps of the victims, gathering details overlooked by overstretched officers. In one case, he noticed that a victim's backpack had been carefully placed against a tree, zipped neatly as if someone had wanted it found. In another, a locket belonging to the victim was discovered half buried in the soil, its chain broken but the pendant intact. These details were not the actions of someone rushing or careless. They were deliberate choices, and that realization chilled Hale to his core. As his investigation widened, Hale turned his attention to the victims themselves. On the surface, they seemed to have nothing in common. One was a college student, another a young mechanic, the third a teacher's aide. They came from different towns, different families, and different social circles. Yet Hale sensed a hidden thread binding them together. He dug into their pasts, combing through old-school records, employment histories, and community ties. The breakthrough came late one night in the dusty archives of a county records office. Buried in a stack of outdated files, Hale discovered that all 3 victims had once attended the same summer camp as children. The camp had closed decades earlier under mysterious circumstances, its land reclaimed by the forest. There were rumors of misconduct, whispers of tragedy, but no official record explained why it had been shut down. Hale's discovery turned the investigation on its head. These were not random murders. They were targeted. The killer was not selecting victims by chance but by connection, reaching back into a past most people had long forgotten. Hale felt a shift in the air as he pieced it together. The scratches on the wrists, once dismissed as meaningless, began to feel like a symbol, a signature pointing back to something from that camp. Each mark was a reminder, perhaps even a message. The realization unsettled him more than anything else he had uncovered. This was no impulsive predator. This was someone with a plan, someone carefully working through a list that only they understood. As word of Hale's findings spread through law enforcement circles, the mood darkened further. What had started as a series of unexplained murders now carried the weight of history, a mystery stretching back decades. The killer wasn't just taking lives. They were reviving ghosts from a past the towns of New England had tried hard to bury. And as Hale stared at the camp's faded records, he couldn't help but wonder just how deep that past truly went. Hale knew that if he wanted answers, he would have to dig into the shadowy history of the camp. The property, once filled with laughter and the carefree noise of children, was now nothing more than an overgrown patch of forest, its cabins collapsing under moss and rot. Locals avoided the area, muttering that it was cursed. To Hale, it was not superstition but silence that spoke the loudest. People remembered far more than they were willing to admit. He started tracking down old staff members, counselors who had worked there during the camp's final summer. Most were reluctant to talk, their faces tightening as soon as he mentioned the name of the place. A few even closed their doors on him, unwilling to dredge up what they clearly considered dangerous memories. Those who did speak offered fragments of unsettling information. They described a place where bullying had been common, where cruel pranks were brushed aside, and where discipline was often ignored. One counselor admitted that the camp had fostered a culture of secrecy, where complaints were quietly silenced to avoid scaring parents or losing funding. The most disturbing story concerned the disappearance of a young counselor. He had vanished without explanation one night, his belongings left neatly folded on his bunk. The official story at the time was that he had quit suddenly and left without telling anyone, but those who were there knew better. His absence had sparked panic, followed by a quick and quiet closure of the camp weeks later. The more Hale investigated, the more he felt he was chasing echoes of a cover-up. Town records confirmed that law enforcement had been called to the camp, but reports were vague, missing key details as if they had been deliberately trimmed down. One line in an old police log caught his eye. Altercation reported between counselor and campers. No injuries confirmed, matter resolved. It was dated the very night the counselor had disappeared. Hale realized then that the so-called resolution had been nothing more than a smokescreen. Cross-referencing camp rosters with the identities of the recent victims, Hale saw a disturbing picture forming. Each murder victim had been a camper present that final summer, children who had been caught up in whatever had happened to that counselor. The scratches on the wrists, repeated again and again across each crime scene, might not have been random at all. Hale began to wonder if they were meant to replicate something from that night, perhaps a struggle, perhaps a mark inflicted as punishment, or maybe even a twisted reminder of guilt. With each revelation, the murders seemed less like a series of isolated killings and more like a systematic campaign of revenge. The killer was not just lashing out. They were settling old debts, cutting through time to punish those who had grown into adulthood with a shared secret. Hale could sense the urgency in the pattern, as if the list was being worked through with grim determination. The realization filled him with unease. He had uncovered the thread tying the victims together, but he still did not know the identity of the avenger who stalked New England's woods. Worse still, the silence of the past meant others may have known the truth all along and chosen to keep it buried. The killer was not only chasing vengeance, they were also pulling into the light a history the towns had spent decades trying to erase. Hale's discoveries had given the case new direction, but just as the path seemed to narrow, a disturbing twist widened it again. Forensic results from the latest crime scene arrived at his desk, and the findings left him stunned. A partial DNA profile recovered from beneath a victim's fingernails matched records from an old database. The name that appeared was not that of an unknown drifter or escaped convict. It belonged to a police officer who had investigated the camp disappearance decades ago. That officer had died years earlier in what had been officially ruled a car accident on a snowy road. His file had long been closed, his reputation regarded as honorable, yet the DNA was undeniable. The question was how it ended up at the scene of a murder committed long after his death. The revelation threw the investigation into turmoil. Some suggested a contamination error, but Hale wasn't convinced. He considered the possibility of planted evidence, a deliberate attempt to shift suspicion. If that were true, the killer had not only knowledge of the victims' pasts, but also access to law enforcement records. The thought gnawed at him. Could the killer have ties to the police? Had someone on the inside been protecting them all these years? As Hale wrestled with the implications, the killer struck again, and this time the message was impossible to ignore. The victim was discovered not hidden in the woods, but placed brazenly on the stone steps of a courthouse. The body was arranged in a way that suggested display, not concealment. The scratches on the wrist were deeper, more pronounced, and clutched in the victim's hand was a single piece of paper. On it, scrawled in uneven handwriting, were the words, "Truth belongs to the dead." The boldness of the act rattled the region. It was no longer a case of a predator lurking in shadows. This was now a killer who wanted to be seen. Panic turned to hysteria as the idea of a taunting murderer spread. Public trust in law enforcement began to fray, especially as rumors circulated about the strange DNA connection to a long-dead officer. Town halls filled with angry residents demanding answers, some accusing the police of hiding the truth. Hale found himself not only hunting the killer, but also defending the very integrity of the investigation. Haunted by the courthouse display, Hale revisited the archived files once more, studying every note, every interview from the camp investigation. He noticed gaps in the paperwork, unexplained delays in reporting, and names of campers who had been interviewed only briefly or not at all. The deeper he looked, the more the records seemed designed to obscure rather than reveal. It was as if someone decades earlier had worked hard to bury the truth and had succeeded. Now, years later, the killer was dragging that truth back into the light with blood. The murders no longer felt like isolated acts of vengeance. They were escalating into a campaign. The killer was no longer content with silence or secrecy. They were leaving breadcrumbs of history, forcing the world to look at what had been hidden. And as Hale traced the trail, he realized with dread that the killings were not nearing an end but entering a far more dangerous phase. The past was not just resurfacing, it was demanding to be reckoned with. The courthouse murder left Hale shaken, but it also gave him clarity. The killer was not hiding anymore. They were demanding recognition, forcing investigators to confront what had been buried decades earlier. Hale knew the only way to catch them was to uncover the full truth about the final summer of the camp. He pulled together every surviving roster, piecing together lists of counselors and campers who had been present the night the young counselor vanished. Cross-checking against the names of the recent victims, the picture grew sharper. Every person killed had been a camper there that summer. The scratches carved into each victim's wrist now seemed to mimic something from that night, perhaps an injury or mark tied to the missing counselor's last moments. Through interviews with townsfolk who finally began to speak, Hale pieced together the horror. On the night of the counselor's disappearance, there had been an altercation between him and a group of older campers. What began as a heated argument spiraled into violence. In the chaos, the counselor had been fatally injured. The children, terrified of what they had done, had hidden the body with the help of a few adults who feared scandal would destroy the camp. Instead of justice, there was silence. The camp closed, the case was buried, and those involved carried the weight of that night into adulthood. The victims of the present murders were those very campers, hunted one by one for their role in the tragedy. The motive was chilling in its precision. The killer was not random, not unhinged, but deliberate, methodical, and fueled by long-simmering rage. Hale traced the connection further and discovered something even darker. The missing counselor had a younger sibling who had also attended the camp as a child. Records showed they had been withdrawn from the program early after the disappearance, vanishing from community life soon afterward. That sibling had grown up in silence, carrying grief and anger, watching from the shadows as the children responsible for their brother Au's death moved on with their lives. Years later, the murders began. For Hale, the pieces now fit together, but the ending came with no neat resolution. Before he could apprehend the suspect, the killings abruptly stopped. Search teams combed the woods where the camp had once stood, but no trace of the killer was found. What remained instead was a chilling message, spray-painted across the crumbling walls of one of the camp's abandoned cabins. Secrets do not stay buried. It was both a confession and a warning, an indication that the cycle of vengeance was over, for now. The case was never officially closed. With no arrest and no trial, the story grew into legend. Residents spoke of the shadow of New England in lowered voices, debating whether the killer had vanished into the wilderness, taken their own life, or simply chosen to disappear. The murders became a haunting reminder of how silence and cover-ups could fester into something monstrous. Hale himself retired years later, still tormented by the knowledge that justice had remained just out of reach. The victims were buried, the camp rotted back into the earth, but the mystery endured. For New England, the past had not been erased. It had simply been written in blood.